There you go. All right. All right. Well, welcome everybody. It's terrific to see you on a sunny day. So thanks for coming. My name's Steve Tedesco, and I'm your Zoom host from Transition Guelph. And we're thrilled to have you to be part of this 10th annual Resilience Festival. It's the first time we've held it virtually, and we're still learning as we go here. It's fantastic. I encourage you to visit the website for other great events and the CD Saturday virtual market. And this Thursday is the keynote event. I'm the presenter, but despite that, I think there's some really important information that we want to share with folks about where we're headed as a society. So I highly encourage you to sign up for that. So before I introduce our speaker, a few housekeeping items for the Zoom session. Please stay on mute to minimize disruptions. And for this session, Alex has asked for the questions to be held to the end, but you can raise your hand at that point and I'll unmute you, or Alex will unmute you to ask your question. We are recording the session, and we hope to post it to the festival website as soon as we can. And please be respectful, kind, and generous during the session. All right, so now it's my pleasure to introduce Alex Savatti. I've known Alex for, I think it's 3 years now. In fact, I think it was the very first Resilience Festival that I helped organize. That was 4 festivals ago. He's an outdoor school mentor. He's a retired Transition Guelph board member and a small business owner. And he recently completed his master's degree in anthropology, basing his thesis on the perceptions and values of both conventional and alternative farmers. So I'm really pleased to have Alex doing his session today. The thesis he's presenting had a very long gestation period. I know he's glad it's over. So Alex is already the co-host of the event, so I will pass it over to Alex to get things rolling. Alex.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome to you, Emilio. Thanks for joining today. Just a quick note, you'll see on the top of the screen there, Emilio, that the event is being recorded. So if you are uncomfortable with having your face on screen, by all means, you can keep your camera off there. And thanks to everyone for joining today. I'm going to share my screen and we'll just kind of walk through the presentation on what became my master's research, but also a personal interest of mine. So give me one moment and I'll get this up there. CJ, your mic is off. Can you give me a yes or no that you can see that clearly? Awesome, rock and roll. And I'm gonna put this on there and give you a little introduction to my research, which was aptly named Finding the Farm, Exploring a Sense of Place in Young Farmers' Educational Pathways. I go by Alex, but for the academic purposes of this presentation, it was under my first name, which is Maurice. So I'll give a little background about myself. As Steve mentioned, I am an outdoor educator. I've worked at the Guelph Outdoor School for 4 years now, as well as working as a backcountry canoe trip guide up in Algonquin Park for about 11 years now. And it's about 2 years ago, started my own business with my brother called The Trip Shed, doing our own backcountry trip guiding. In addition to that, I'm a very novice gardener. I've had a farm plot 2 years at Steve Tedesco's farm, actually out at the Coyote Hollow Farm, and last year at Ignatius. And I've had my own backyard garden plots over the course of my life. My community member here in Guelph. I've been in Guelph now 9 years. Currently living in the Junction Village neighborhood, and really brought into the fold of the Transition Guelph community about 4 years ago, getting involved with the Resilience Festival and then sitting on the board. And as the Guelph kind of does its thing, the web began to grow from that point. And my big interest, both academically and personally in the world, is how people relate to the world around us. And, you know, my self-proclaimed role as a storyteller in the world, I think really dovetails with that beautifully. which fit into anthropology, which is essentially using stories about how we, as human beings, relate to each other and relate to the world around us, which is different from culture to culture. Before we get started, I will also just throw down some gratitude for the day, as I'm sure us all are feeling super grateful for the sunshine, for the new flowers springing out of the ground, and for all the life that is buzzing around us. It's super exciting. The study design for this research, there was a context that it existed inside of, and that was a few different components. First and foremost was looking at the differences between, or I guess acknowledging that there was a difference between the perceptions of big farms, which are often categorized inside industrial or conventional farming ways, and then little farms, small scale, ecological, organic as the buzzword, sustainable as the buzzword. And those kind of sat at this and both ends of the spectrum of what agriculture can be in the world today. Another part of the context was looking at the incoming generations of farmers. Who is tending the land? As you know, the average age of farmer in Canada is rising. I think it's at 57 right now, the average age of the farm operator. So as that continues to go up, you know, how are new people finding the land, and in what way are they finding that land? The overall research question, as you'll see, is what influence does a sense of place have on young farmers' educational pathways? So as young farmers learn to farm, how are they getting there? And again, so these two ends of the spectrums, one being, you know, the very formal agricultural pathway or education pathway, which is something like the OAC, the Ontario Agricultural College University education system, versus alternative agricultural education, which ranges from anything between just like learning as you go, to internship programs, to woofing, to volunteering, to backyard gardening and growing from that scale. I guess the sub-questions for this research included how a young person creates their own sense of place within a given educational trajectory. And we'll get into sense of place a bit more shortly, as well as what impact does a relationship to the land have on this sense of place. So looking at how young people growing up, especially, what their relationship to the environment and to the land looked like, and how did that influence how they made meaning out of the land that they lived on. And then how is an agricultural identity formed within the context of a sense of place inside the experience of a particular educational pathway? So as they're going through this educational system, whatever that might be, how do they start to create their own ground as a farmer? And how is that informed by a sense of place? So the data collection for this project, it existed in Wellington County, so mainly in the Guelph area, some folks living outside of Guelph and in the surrounding sort of towns, townships. It took place during fall and winter of 2018, with then an addition of some more research during the winter of 2019. And I sought out to really speak to two pools of participants. One were folks in the OAC, so the farming students at the sort of ends of the spectrum of formal education, and then students in the alternative ag space. And for the sake of my own words, I'll just say ag instead of agriculture for the duration of this workshop. So the alternative ag students, and initially that was going to be primarily students who were part of the Sustainable Farming Certificate program at Everdale Farm. Because of some difficulty in accessing a right amount of students to be able to give me a proper data pool, I ended up expanding that to folks that consider themselves learning how to farm in a non-formal way. So that included people who had done the program in the past, people who were self-taught, people who were in different internships, and so on. And this was really just to try and the interviews that I had was to try and capture the experience and the stories of student farmers from different backgrounds, different ends of the spectrum. So being an academic researcher, there always needs to be some undertones of theory to how we talk about our work. So there were two main theoretical orientations for this research. The first one utilized some key concepts by a researcher named Bourdieu, and those are capital, habitus, and field, and we'll get into those in a moment, as well as a sense of place. And that is often defined, it's defined in many ways, but for the purpose of this research was defined in place meaning and place attachment. So Bourdieu talks about a couple main ideas. One being capital. Capital is community-held resources that are passed down through generations that show up in the world as symbolic elements, such as skills, preferences, tastes, essentially the things that are reproduced from generation to generation, i.e., like from like. So these exist in the realms of social, economic, and cultural capital. He also talks about this notion of field. Now, field is kind of the space where these different forms of capital become utilized. It's where they materialize, it's where they're operationalized. So, for example, the field of education, we can imagine that some folks that might have certain ways of speaking, for example, to use linguistic capital, that would show up inside of an educational system in conversation in classes. As a very rudimentary example, but the field is the network or the configuration of the different relationships that exist between these positions. It's the external space where relationships occur, and those relationships are often informed by, in addition to capital, the habitus. Now, the habitus is these kind of internalized, taken for granted ways of being in the world that are expressed through how we experience the world itself, how we feel, how we think, how the world occurs to us is what the habitus is. So you can imagine it as kind of like our map that we are born with, or that we are taught at a young age of what the world is. It's the internal nature of human beings. It's these shared, taken for granted assumptions, meanings, and behaviors of the way things are. And now, sense of place. So there are a lot of different variations and definitions of how this gets talked about, explored by geographers, anthropologists, sociologists alike. For the purpose of this research, I utilized Edward Ralph's definition of sense of place, which is place attachment plus place meaning gives us a sense of place. Place attachment refers to the bond between people and places related to, this kind of relates to how we create identity. So I live in Guelph. I have an attachment to the city of Guelph, and I often, can refer to myself as a Guelphite, for example, is one way that I have a place attachment to the city of Guelph. Place meaning is the symbolic meanings that I ascribe to places. So, for example, the city of Guelph is my home. It's where my community happens. It's where, I have strong relationships. It's where a lot of my work takes place, and it means a lot. The meaning of it shifts. Laundry is done. The meaning of it shifts based on how strong their relationship to it is. A sense of place is used to understand place identity. So informing the influences of place relationships on people's tastes, interests, priorities. Somebody once said, to be a Guelphite means that you are a vegetarian. They were talking about something else, but that, I don't think that's obviously the case, but there is this, I guess, people can sometimes equate who you are and what your preferences would be based on where you come from and how you identify with that place. And it's funny, the day after that was told to me, I went to the market and was feeling I was trying on the way of being a Guelphy, and somebody offered me something with the plus that it was vegetarian. Beginning in childhood, these sense of places exist, and they become stronger as they correlate with pro-environmental behaviors. So it's been found that people with really strong inclinations to be more environmentally conscious also have really strong sense of place, which was interesting as far as farming goes. And the hypothesis was sort of this chart was that my assumption was that people that went to the OAC or conventional farming backgrounds maybe didn't have that strong of a sense of place or relationship to the land as I assumed people in the alt ag world did, these small scale unconventional farmers. And I think there's, again, these are my characteristic assumptions of these farmers, that the OAC produced people who were the real farmers, that actual world of farming existed there, whereas small scale farming and unconventional in the alt ag realm was kind of this romantic notion of farming that we can often picture in our mind about rolling hills and roosters crowing and all this stuff. And that's kind of the baseline assumption hypothesis that I went into this research with. Looking at some of the findings from the OAC. So I had 5 interviews in total. And the context of the OAC really held that it was this really rich history of a school that was, I guess to sum all that up, it was founded in its like academic excellence. It had powerful research, it had a lot of money, and that's kind of the air people got when they went into this school system, and as they still do. This is, informed by the interviews that I've had. And looking at the field of the OAC, some of the relations that exist in the space there, three main areas were pulled out. So the economic relations, teaching relations, and the family relations. Economic things like, the payment of tuition, where the school gets its funding from, where the research gets its funding from. As far as teaching, what opens up to students through teaching relationships, so opportunity access through teachers, the influence that teachers have on how they see the world of agriculture. And a big piece that people often shared about the OAC was their family relations, that they, in many cases, students that I spoke to, someone in their family line had gone to the OAC to study agriculture as well. So there was this really strong legacy of family ties to the school there. I had one participant say, there's something about being at Guelph. You walk the hallways, you know that so many people have walked before. You see the old buildings, you smell the farm research areas, you're surrounded by labs and people you can imagine are much smarter than yourself. There's knowledge in the air. It makes you want to be better. It makes you think that you're a part of something so much bigger than yourself. Just being here makes you want to do better. And this, the way that this showed up in people were three main areas. So community, morality, and sustainability. And people found that, they, at the OAC, they really were privy to a community of people that, you couldn't get elsewhere. And there was a really strong tie, which related, I think, to their family ties of this OAC community. And that became a part of how they define themselves. I'm an Aggie is often, if you're ever around the OAC, you'll see folks wearing the OAC jackets. The Aggies, there's a really strong sense of identity that exists in being at the school. Morality is something that came up too. Oftentimes students there would share that the way that they were doing it was the right way of doing it. Because this is the way that we can actually feed people. This is the way that needs to get done. Small scale farming isn't actually viable as a way of doing what we need to do to feed the people in the world. And in that context, they were, and sometimes had this underlying tone of holding the moral high ground, that they were doing the right thing by really producing ways that were functional and guaranteed to work. And that related to sustainability is that, how can we do whatever we need to do using the research we have at the school to be able to ensure that this land will give us X amount of crops for X amount of years and keep doing that indefinitely. So overall, folks at the OAC, they really did have these deep relationships to place. They existed in strong family ties, in strong university ties, in strong ties to the farm that they were raised on. And their love, and that was one of the questions I had for folks often was, do you love your land? And I loved asking that question because everyone answered it differently. And for the OAC folks, their love of the land was often characterized through this notion of tradition and responsibility, that farm that they came from often was one that had been tended by their family for years and years and years. And they owed it to that farm and to their family to tend it as best they could by any means necessary. Looking at the alt ag area was a bit different, but had some surprisingly similar undertones. So I had 6 interviews that took place here. And again, the context of who I spoke to, education as internships, volunteering, certificate programs, practice, trial and error, and just learning on their own. So back to that field idea of some of the relations that take place, and I see a typo in this field of the alt ag, not the OAC. So we've got economic, oftentimes the way that economic relations take place in learning to farm in the alt ag sphere exists as labor as tuition. So kind of, woofing is something similar to that, where you offer up your own labor, your own working hands in return for education, for a place to live, for workshops. And a lot of these places also were funded by market sales. So farmers markets that they would bring in money to the farm to be able to make it run. The relationships surrounding teaching. So you've got these community teachers that, these members of the community that exist there that are both farmers themselves, landowners, and the people offering up the knowledge. And something that often came up too that I really loved hearing them share was the land as the teacher. So especially in these areas of trial and error, folks would have a small farm for the first 5 years, with having no prior farming experience, and it was kind of this like, let's see what happens if we try this. We'll do a bit of reading and research on our own, and let's try this out and see what happens. And if it doesn't work, we'll try something else next time. And as far as family relations, oftentimes a few farmers that I spoke to said that they grew up with alternative parents, what they would refer to as, hippie parents. One farmer spoke about, his family being a part of the first CSA that existed in Ontario. And they always had this, different view of how we get our food, how our food is grown. And that for them played a role in, what kind of farming they wanted to see in the world and what they wanted to practice themselves. So overall, some of the findings that came out of this in the realms of these 4 areas, so education, morality, community, and sustainability. There were a lot of similarities. Obviously, they got played out a bit differently, but so for education, for example, the question is what type of education and why that? And largely the findings were that this was influenced by the path that made the most sense based on their upbringing. So farmers who grew up in conventional farming backgrounds, it is an obvious choice to go to a space that would allow them to keep building that, I guess that like their realm of the world, their understanding of what agriculture is. Why would they, that was the obvious choice. Again, the other side of that, for somebody who grew up in an alternative community or an alternative household where the relationship to farming and how we got our food was maybe a bit different, it would make sense to try and learn things that fit into that modality. As far as morality, again, this was an interesting one because both groups of people saw that they were doing the right thing in their eyes. They were doing the thing that made the most sense and something that they knew worked. And how this played out often, though, was this like difference between, for conventional farmers, it was economic versus abundance, or economic/abundance. So how, the right thing is to make sure that we have enough, to make sure that our farmers are well paid, that our land is taken care of, that we can keep growing food and by any means necessary. Whereas alternative ags usually had this context of, this broader holistic ecological health of, the right thing to do is to make sure that every single thing that is involved in the process, from the farmer to the land to the biome to the microbes to the people that are eating the food, is as healthy and well tended as can be. As far as community, there was this slightly nuanced difference in how, because community was a very crucial thing to both pools of participants. For conventional farmers, community was really related to being a part of something that was well established. The towns and communities that they came from had been and have been farming towns for years and years and years and years. And the kind of farming that they did and that they do fit inside of what that community knows and accepts. In the alternative agricultural space, oftentimes the farmers spoke about that their farm and their way of farming was a catalyst for community, that it was creating community just by simply existing. And a lot of times these farms exist as community hubs, and they offer a lot more than just food. They're meeting spaces for their wedding venues. They hold team meetings. They're a cornerstone of something bigger than just a food production space. And lastly, the sort of nuanced difference in sustainability. So for the conventional farming realm, sustainability looked often at making the current dominant system better and economically sustainable. What else do we have to put into this to make it work better, but make sure that we don't lose any money and make sure that we keep production on the consistent, sustainable up ramp? Versus the alternative agricultural space, which is largely spoke of, how do we reduce our input? How do we focus on the holistic, back to that idea of every member in the sort of food chain from microbe to person eating it, how do we make sure that in the long term they are well taken care of and healthy? And how do we create new ways outside of the current system? So there was the view there that the current system was inherently unsustainable based on the amount of input that was required to make it tick. So how do we imagine something that doesn't fit inside of that? How do we create something new involving the other realms of community and education and morality? Like, it's a very bringing all these pieces together. Some of the common themes. So the type of educational pathway. So we've got the OAC and the formal, and the OAC and the alternative. So to sum up some of these findings, community. For OAC folks, community was key in their identity. It was related to the community of their childhood. It was a part of their legacy, and they had to tend and take care of that legacy and that community. And it was often more present in conversations about the past. It was like, this is where I come from. Versus the alternative agricultural space, which is community is created inside of their identity as they create community. It's related to where we're going, less than where we come from. It's related to community creation. It's future oriented in its building model, and it's also about caretaking. Morality, again, the OAC, the right thing means to look after your people. Farming is a way to maximize output to bring survival to our communities, both economic and food. Versus, for example, the alternative space, morality as the right thing to do in contrast to the wrong ways of doing it, which are happening right now. Looking at the impact on the earth, looking at creating integrated communities where, there's like a closed loop community system where a lot more happens than, like I said before, than just growing food on the space. And lastly, sustainability at the OAC level. There was this notion that because they came from this place of this excellent research legacy background school, that it was smarter. That this was the status quo. This is what produced high yields of food. This is how we make sure that we can do it for a long time by researching, by coming up with new varieties and strains and inputs and whatever it is. Try and get ahead of these problems by outsmarting them. Versus alternative, for example, here in the sustainability realm, there was a big focus on regeneration as sustainability. That in order to really have something that can last a long time, we have to heal what the status quo is right now. We have to heal the soil, heal our visions of food, bring in new visions of how we feed ourselves and how community is tended and how agriculture is done and what the role that plays in the community. It's this holistic health of the earth and all of its inhabitants.
Alex, it's Steve.
Yes.
Yeah, we're at half past. I just want to give you a time check.
Perfect. That's great. I've got maybe about 5 or 10 minutes left, and then we can take some questions. Sense of place. So looking at how sense of place showed up in dominantly for these two realms of students. So for the OAC, place meaning. So the farm meant this. It was the family legacy. It was community as a strong place of pride, and it was a simple way of life. Alt Ag, the farm is this community hub itself. It is a space for healthy, holistic tending of all things, of all people, and it's a return back to the good life. So that even in talking about this, we can see that there are different ways that it was expressed, but have similar nuances. Like the simple way of life for the OAC, to me, sounded similar to back to the good life in the Alt Ag realm. Place attachment in the OAC, these deep family ties, this relationship to community members, this childhood memories that people would speak of growing up and being woken up by their parents at 5 a.m. to go out and harvest corn or whatever it was. In the Alt Ag space, place attachment as, growing up in a place that had alternative communities and the things that they were interested in. This deep love of the land in a different context than, it as a resource. And the close ties to the communities that were created inside of that alternative way of doing things. And again, alternative to the status quo of agricultural and the communities that surrounded that. So sense of place overall, if we're looking at meaning plus attachment, and its effects on pathway decisions and educational pathway decisions. For the OAC, people often saw it as honoring the past while building the future. So holding up the status quo upholding that community way of doing things, the right way of doing it, while also bringing in new ways of improving it in the future. Choosing the pathways that are in line with these values. The alternative agriculturalists often spoke of, being guided by the land into the future. So a return back to soil health, to regeneration, to, community creation. So rather than choosing pathways that are in line with these values, it's creating pathways to generate these values. So overall, some of the similarities that I found in these institutions, OAC and alt-ag education institutions, is that they both see themselves as a system that works. They both support their students, and they're both, in ways, innovating the system that currently exists. As far as the characteristics of how they operate, both have a vision for a sustainable future. They both want to tend their communities. They both want to be economically prosperous. And they both see themselves as, morally correct. And what this research showed, and this was the stark finding that I came to at the end, was that really this common importance of a sense of place, these two groups ultimately want the same thing. When I said at the beginning, seeing them as two opposing ends of the spectrum that were in opposition with each other, I think there often can be that assumption, but upon closer look, they just want a good life for their families and communities. And they want to ensure that their farms are healthy and capable of producing the crops that they need to survive. They want future generations to be well looked after, and they want their legacies to live on as people who did the right thing in the world. I'll stay on this one for a bit because that really struck me, and I'll let this sit for a moment. And I think, oftentimes in speaking with folks in the alt-ag space, there was, to bluntly state it, there was sometimes a perception of conventional farmers as bad. And there was sometimes a perception from the conventional farming world as alt-ag farmers as ridiculous, as like not actually viable, as why would I ever do that? And inside of that perception that either one has of the other, there was no space to come together and actually create something collectively that will, I think, is necessary to catapult us into, this next era of food production that works for everybody, that works for the land, that works for the earth, that works for the environment. And I think that until such time that we can come together and have a conversation and maybe let go of those perceptions that we hold of the other person as this way, nothing will be able to really shift at a large scale. And right now what we need, evidently, are large scale shifts as the world rapidly changes, as climate change, we start to feel its effects. We've been feeling its effects for years. So I think that's a really important point that this research for me showed, that we, there's got to be a way for us to come to the table and have a conversation about how do we do this together. Some further, just think how this is. I can skip that one. Anyways, moving forward, some of the challenges that people obviously spoke about when starting their own farm and getting into the agricultural space is access to land, access to capital to buy land, to buy equipment, to buy anything they need to start up the farm, access to education. So for those people that don't know, if they can't gain access to internships or schools or whatever it might be, there's a challenge there of even what to do in the first place. In order for them to gain access to land or capital, they're often going into debt, which, if they're not making enough money, is very obviously difficult to come out of. And the competition that exists from, corporate agricorps that, own and buy up a lot of the land and that are difficult to outbid for any available land. Some of the solutions at a very, very bare bones scale, they can go a lot deeper than this, of course, and there are a lot more. Governmental policy and funding for small-scale ecological farmers so that we can try and up and bring that to a bit more center stage and make it more viable for more people. My personal preference and my personal suggestion, coming from my own background in the nature education realm, is the slide before, without going too deep into it, but one of this idea is that depending on the context, a shift in relationship occurs to land and influence based on pro-environmental behavior. And that often comes from being exposed to nature connection. It's one of the pieces of research that I came across. So I, firmly believe, as a proponent of being outside for all folks and spending time in nature, that starting kids young and building a strong relationship to the natural world at a young age will ultimately create people who are more inclined to act pro-environmentally in whatever decisions they make. And if that's in the agricultural realm, I think we'll have people who are more inclined to create ecologically sensitive or ecologically minded farms and ways of producing food and building community if they have that pre-instilled relationship to the land through nature-based education. Overall, the findings in this study showed that a sense of place for conventional farmers often related to their community and the people within them first, followed by a relationship to land. On the other hand, alternative farmers displayed a sense of place that was predominantly defined by a relationship to the environment, followed by a connection to the communities that were a part of it. And to be clear, these two themes were often intertwined. It's not black and white. Nothing in this space was. I'll stay on that one for another moment. Some of the gaps in this research, and just to finish up, the research pool was smaller than I anticipated, than I wanted it to be. So I think there can be ways to expand to include more than just Wellington County, to look at Ontario or Canada in broader contexts. Exploring a larger age range. So I would love to explore how a sense of place shows up for farmers that are maybe exiting the field, and what the influence they have or what that has had on them. And the modality of research was qualitative, so a lot of interviewing, and I think there could be value to be brought to this kind of research study using a more quantitative approach, with maybe more structured surveys. And some other things to look at, like what other internalized factors contribute to a decision-making process of farmers entering the field? What do perceptions of others, whether familial or societal, have on the experience of becoming a farmer? How does the current decline of agricultural operations influence their morale or sense of hope? And what influence do other global transitions like recessions or economic shocks have on the viability of new farmers' success in agriculture? Some food for thought. And I believe that I'm at my final thoughts. This thesis really started out by acknowledging this picturesque vision of the farm, like I spoke to before: rolling hills, rooster crows, that sort of romantic image we have. And as new farmers enter the field hoping to build a way of life that is both meaningful and fruitful, it's important to remember that at the core of what they do and why they do it is a deep love. And this love extends to their land, to their families, and to their communities, in both conventional and alt ag folks. As the landscape continues to evolve and new challenges are faced and overcome, there is still yet hope that in the shadow of an industrializing, depletive agricultural system that dominates our country, there will be an even more rapidly growing body of farmers tending themselves and the land at the same table in ways that leave room for future generations to do the same. With that, I thank you all for joining, and I'd be happy to take any questions. And just hear maybe some of your thoughts, even if they're not questions, how some of this has landed for you and what thoughts you might have on. I'll stop my share there on that.
Yeah, I guess I'll hop in on that. And I don't know if it is a question, it could be, but a thought as well as I love your suggestions going forward about engaging the youth, because as corny as it sounds, they totally are our future. And those mindsets need to change, and as well as government policies. But yeah, I think too, those people who are past, sort of have those habits set already and are past that educational phase of their life. How do we engage with them too to get those minds more open as well to changing what feels fixed in a habit or a mindset,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's a great question. And Steve suggested a documentary to me a while back, which I forget now what the name of it is, but it was largely centered around that topic of how do we, people who already have a lot of the land that are set in the ways of doing it, how do we start to shift that? I think one of the things is demonstrating viability. I think demonstrating, like speaking to the things that matter to them, like economic viability and the quality of their soil, and showing that a shift is actually more, is richer and more productive than the dominant current mode that is in place.
Looks like Steve has a question.
First, Alex, great job. I really enjoyed. I had the pleasure of reading his work a few weeks ago, so I knew what to expect. The movie, by the way, was called Kiss the Ground. And it's I think it was made 2 years ago, so it's right up to date and it's excellent. So I have an observation. I'm not sure there's a question, but you might want to react to it. You know, I think conventional farmers are a terrific group of people who really do care and they want to do the right things. They're a product of a cultural narrative that started about 10,000 years ago when agriculture took hold. And what that narrative says is that humans are above and separate from the ecology around them. And there's a growth imperative. It's just grow, 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 and consume whatever you need or want. And so when you look at that, it's happened many times in history that civilizations outgrow their ability to feed themselves, because the more you produce, the more population grows, and eventually you either exhaust your resources or the population exceeds your carrying capacity. Fortunately, in the past, that's only happened in localized areas, but sometimes with devastating consequences. So I was just listening to an interview with a guy named Joseph Tainter, who is an anthropologist who studied the collapse of civilizations. And he pointed to several of them, like the Maya. And the other one that really caught my attention was civilization, I think a couple thousand years ago, multiple millennia ago, in Iraq. And this was the second collapse, I believe. And to try to keep up with their growing population, they irrigated the heck out of their land to the point that they poisoned the land because of the salt that was starting to come out of the irrigation. That land is uninhabitable to this day. So millennia later, the soil is just too salty to support plant life. So, you know, we haven't learned as a species. I think that our cultural narrative is effectively suicidal. We just keep doing it to ourselves. And, you know, I don't blame the conventional farmers per se. It's just that we've got to learn as a species to kick that narrative habit and find a different narrative. And I think that's where the alt farmers are coming from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's like a thought coming up in my mind as you were saying that. It was like, maybe we're as humans just destined to build civilizations that inherently crumble and then start again elsewhere, and then just that'll be the cycle, which is kind of a doom and gloom thought. I'd like to believe that that's not what's going to happen, and maybe, you know, the old nature-based education really does hold weight in strengthening relationships to young people as they grow up, so that there's knowledge of this. It can be hard to, I think, hold a sense of hope inside of like the proven track record of humans to destroy most of the things that they create. And I think that, you know, it's the people that don't lose sight of that hope that are often part of the creation of something new. I think in many ways we're seeing that right now in what's happened in the world in the past year, and as there's all this new vacuum to create something new, and it's both nerve-wracking and exciting, you know, all at the same time. Yeah. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, concerns?
I have a thought question.
Sure.
So Alex and I watched Kiss the Ground together, and so what I took from that documentary was like again, that regenerative farming can be done at scale and is economically viable at an industrial agricultural level. And so I'm curious, Alex, if like if conversations about things like regenerative farming at scale came up in your conversations with the OAC students, because you mentioned like there's this sort of stereotypical attitude about, you know, the alt ag people are, I forget what you said, but basically like ridiculous. And on the alt ag side, that the traditional industrial farming folks are bad people. So I'm just wondering, like, did the people that you talked to who were intending to farm in an industrial manner at a huge scale, did they talk about these ideas around making regenerative agriculture work at that scale?
Some did, and some, you know, I had some farmers who said that it just like was ridiculous and that we're not going to change the world with backyard gardens, and it's a nice thought and it sounds nice, but it's not functional whatsoever. And then it also showed up for other farmers in different ways of like, I remember one person was talking about his family farm and that they were starting to explore like crop rotations, or, you know, year off, well, I forget what it's called, but leaving the land fallow for a year, whatever that is. So little, I guess, tactics that maybe aren't as in line with the dominant norm of industrialized farming.
Okay.
There's no way to put it. Yeah.
So it's very much like a that's for those other small scale people, that's not for us conversation.
Yeah, and I think there was also, and maybe it's just a matter of scale, there was like, you know, we're not going to, the amount of food that we have to produce to keep our farm alive and to feed our population is just not going to happen with small scale farming.
Which is interesting because that's like the opposite of the argument that the documentary made, which is like, it actually can be done.
Well, and it needs to be done because like you look at some of the numbers of what industrial farming operations are actually dealing with, and it's not economically viable in the long term, and it's not, you know, as far as the health of the soil, it's not, you know, it's not sustainable. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you very much. Awesome. Well, thank you to you three for coming out. It was a pleasure to chat and a nice brush up with my master's research with far less pressure than the last time I gave that presentation. So that's a nice treat.
Alex, thanks so much. It's even though it's a shame there were more people. I think CJ said there were 15 signups. So we both think that the weather had a big influence.
It is beautiful outside.
It is absolutely gorgeous out there. But I wanted to say thank you so much for sharing this. It's such a crucial topic, and it would be terrific to get this message out. Ella's question is bang on, and that would be an interesting one to pursue a bit more, because I don't think conventional farmers are being presented with what they see are viable options. They're so literally invested with millions of dollars of conventional equipment and whatnot. It's hard to see your way past that big investment. But any successful change management exercise I've been through, you've got to show people how they can win and give them a transition that helps them to get there. So again, Alex, well done. Terrific research. I think it was well balanced. You didn't cast anybody as villain or hero here. It's really a product, I think, of our cultural norms that we're trying to struggle to come to grips with. And I think you did a great job. So well done.
Thank you. You know, actually, if I can just, one other thought that came to mind as you were just speaking there, you know, I think there might be value in acknowledging that, there needs to be some kind of breakthrough to happen for this to really shift in a big way. And that oftentimes those breakthroughs are not fun. They're turbulent, they can be messy. I know a farmer shared with me this idea of biodynamic stirring. It's like you stir a mixture one way and then you stop and then you stir the other way. In that moment of going the other way, there's chaos, and there's chaos happening, and then something else is created as the new wave gains rhythm. And I think that there needs to be perhaps a weighing of what chaos would occur and what turbulence would happen as a result of a big shift, versus what chaos and turbulence will happen as a result of not shifting whatsoever. And it might happen years down the line, but what are we willing to deal with?
I think the globe is on the precipice. In fact, we might have already passed that tipping point, and last year was truly the first year in a new age, and the changes might be coming a lot quicker than we think, and that might shake everybody out of their zone. So thanks for that thought. I appreciate it. We are out of time, and so I will say the session is concluded, and I hope you do all enjoy the rest of the festival. And I do encourage you to sign up for the keynote, because I've alluded to a number of things here that I think people need to get their heads around to be prepared. All right. Thanks, Alex. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.